Chapter 3. In the reed camp, Milt Elliot stood guard all night, and at the first sign of morning Jim left his bed. He was weak from loss of blood and hunger, but he refused to take anything except a cup of coffee before he left. He had a saddle mare that was little more than skin and bones. He didn't take a saddle or even a blanket because, he said, the people up the hill would think he was smuggling food out. He went to the wagon to say goodbye to his wife and 2 small sons. Margaret had not slept. She was whiter this morning, but she didn't weep or cling to him. She pressed a kiss on his bearded mouth and said, "Goodbye, dear, and good luck." Virginia and Patty had left their bed when their father rose. They had made the coffee for him. Reed knelt at the fire and put arms around them. They didn't weep. This tall, slender stepchild and this tiny daughter who had the ways of a woman. Virginia said, "Daddy, when you camp, leave us a little note each morning to say how you are." "I will, dear, if I can," said Patty. "We'll camp where you camp, so leave signs around." "Yes, Patty dear, and you be a brave little woman. Take care of Mama and Jimmy and Tommy." "Please don't worry about us," Patty said. Milt Elliot was holding the mare, and now Jim mounted and spoke to him. "Take care of them, Milt." "I shall do my best." Reed threw a kiss to his daughters and turned up the hill. He thought there might be a move to stop him when he reached the big camp, but nobody there seemed to notice him except Will Foster, and Murphy's son-in-law. He came over and grasped Reed's hand. "Good luck, Jim." "Good luck, Will." Then Reed faced west and rode away. As soon as his back was to them, everybody in the camp watched him go. Mary Graves would have wished him luck, but in her mother's heart there was only bitterness. "Like as not," she said, "the Injuns will get him, and that will serve him right." Keseberg's small eyes, pale and cold, like those of a predatory beast, stared after Reed until horse and rider passed out of sight. Then he turned to his wife and said, "There goes the bastard. The Injuns will fix him." Philippine turned sad eyes on her husband. The man often abused her and sometimes flogged her. She loathed his small, greedy soul and the delight he had taken in thrusting a wagon tongue up for a gallows. Without speaking, she went over to where Frank Graves and some others were burying Snyder. Tall and thin and middle-aged, though she was only 32, she watched them lay a board in a trench, lay Snyder unshrouded upon the board, and place a board upon him before they shoveled in the sand. Then Graves bowed his head and uttered a brief prayer. This was the morning of October 6th. They had rounded the big bend of Mary's River, close by where Winnemucca stands today, and were heading into the southwest. When they pulled out of camp, Graves took the lead. His son-in-law fell in next, and after him moved the Breens. Fetching up the rear of the main camp was Mrs. Murphy and her brood, and a little distance behind them were the Eddies and Reeds. Before daylight, Bill Eddy had gone out to hunt, and to place himself in the path of Reed and give him a gun and ammunition and a little food. When he returned, he came in behind the caravan, and only his family and the Reeds and Milt knew that he had been out. In the wagons now none rode except the smallest children and the adults, who were too sick or feeble to walk. The others trudged beside the teams in the hot dust or fell in behind. Dust rose in such heavy gray clouds that the train was lost in it. Dust settled deep on the wagons. It mixed with the sweat and lathered the beasts. It formed ridges round the dry mouths and eyes of the people and was like powdered stone in their lungs. It made the axles squeal and the yoke squeak. It slowed across the valleys of wheels and spilled in endless cascades from the rising spokes and the hubs. It filled the shoes of those who walked, and forced them again and again to pause and empty their shoes. Nobody had tried to bathe since they had left the wells more than 200 miles back. Mary's River on their left was a foul, sluggish stream whose waters made them sick and gave their beasts a bellyache. It was a strange river for these people. Unlike all the other rivers they had known, it became smaller the farther it flowed, and somewhere ahead of them vanished into a sinkhole. But their big problem now was food. The Breens and Donners still had plenty, or at least were rumored to have by those who starved. But some, like the Reeds and Eddies, had so little that day and night they suffered the pains of hunger. Eleanor had only some sugar and tea, enough coffee for another day or two, and a handful of flour. Margaret Reed had little more than that. The two small Reed children and the Eddy babies rode in the Reed wagon, and from time to time those walking behind would draw the canvas aside and look in. "Children, are you all right?" Jimmy Reed, a lad of 5, always answered yes. When the children fretted for water, they were given a lump of sugar to suck. Patty Reed insisted on walking. "I can walk," she would say, her small face white with dust and fatigue. "Daddy would want me to walk, I know." This evening they came to the spot where Jim Reed had spent his first night, and there they found a note from him. It was a warning. Indians, it said, had attacked the Donners and killed several of their beasts. Virginia and Patty made a sagebrush fire on the ashes left by their father. "I guess he set about here," said Patty, and seated herself gravely, as if to share his loneliness or draw from his strength. After reading the note, Bill Eddy told the others of its warning, and while they were considering the matter and wondering which man would stand guard, Bill observed that one of their members was missing. It was old Hardcoop, the strange Belgian who could speak hardly a word of English. Bill asked his wife, "Have you seen Hardcoop? I think we've lost him." "He fell behind about noon. Honey, didn't you know it?" "Hell, no. We passed right by him. I guess you didn't see him for the dust." "I'll have to find him," said Bill, and without waiting to taste food, he went back into the desert night. There was a moon, and the desert looked very unreal to this young man from the green hills of Illinois. It looked, as he had heard Tamsen say, as if it had been covered by the grey tent of the sky. Tamsen was a painter who said things like that. Like Charlie Stanton, she was a poet. "Hello!" Bill called from time to time as he followed the tracks. Hardcoop was a funny duck. Why an old man, fresh from Belgium, and without family or a single friend, had embarked on this journey was a mystery to all of them. Nobody knew his first name. He was a thin man, very feeble and old. Because he could speak no English, he had made no friends, and from the first he had ridden or eaten with any family that would suffer his presence. After so many wagons had been abandoned, Hardcoop had had to walk, and day after day he had trudged behind, a solitary spectre of bones and dust. Bill Eddy retraced 4 miles before he found him. The old fellow was sitting by a sagebrush, nodding as if asleep. Bill shook him. "Hey, what are you doing back here?" Hardcoop pointed to his feet. His boots were worn out, and his swollen feet had been cut by sand and rock. "You'll have to come along," Bill said. But he remembered then that Hardcoop didn't understand English. He remembered, too, that this morning the old man had begun the journey in Kasseberg's wagon. He supposed that Kasseberg had thrown him out. Raising the man to his feet, Eddy put a thin arm across his shoulders and his own strong arm around Hardcoop's waist. Then he started back across 4 miles of desert. Hardcoop's feet were almost bursting with pain, but he never uttered a sound. With all the strength and courage he had, he hobbled along, supporting a part of his weight on Eddie, pausing now and then to ease his feet and let his weary old head sink to his breast. It was midnight before Eddie reached camp with his burden. Eleanor gave the old man some strong coffee and 2 lumps of sugar, and with some oil which she had brought for her baby, she rubbed his feet. Then she spread a blanket on the ground, and Hardcoop lay on it and reached up worshipfully to pat her arm. She drew the blanket over him and brushed back from his eyes a long grey lock of hair. Margaret Reed and her children slept in her big wagon. The Eddies threw a rope on the ground, and the 4 of them lay on it, with 2 thin blankets to cover them. They put the children between them, and across the children Bill reached to find and clasp his wife's hand. At daylight the camp was awake and getting ready to pull out. Bill's oxen had staggered so the day before that he told Margaret they would have to abandon her big wagon. Graves was leaving a smaller one, and they would take it. "What you think is best, Bill, that's what we'll do." "I guess it isn't so much what's best. It's what we have to do now." "Yes, I know." Because they could no longer take more than bedding and food and utensils, most of the Reed belongings were left behind. After Eleanor had given Hardcoop a cup of coffee and a spoonful of flour, Bill told Mill to hitch to the smaller wagon and pull out. Hardcoop seemed refreshed this morning and said he was able to walk, or at least they understood his gestures to mean that. Bill told his wife he thought the old man would be all right, and then, taking his gun, he set off into the hills in search of wild game. This day for these weary emigrants was like the day before. Bill didn't return until toward evening, his hands empty, and at once he looked around for Hardcoop. "Honey, where's that old codger? Didn't he come in?" "He sat down to rest. We thought he said he would come along." Bill was too exhausted to go back, but he said he would build a big fire to guide the old man in. Until after midnight he kept the fire burning, and then, calling Milt to take over, he lay down to sleep. But when morning came, old Hardcoop was still missing. "I'll have to go back," said Bill. He looked over at the Graves and Breen families, both of whom had saddle horses. He went first to Frank Graves. "Frank, Hardcoop didn't come in. If you let me take a horse, I'll go after him." Graves would have said yes, but his wife, who was the real boss of this big family, overheard the request. "No," she said, "but the old man will die. Like as not we'll all die. We sure will, if we stop to bother with him. But you could go on. I'll pick him up and overtake you." "I still say no. If it's a horse you want, go see Pat Breen." Bill went to Pat's camp. "Pat, how's to borrow your saddle mare? Old Hardcoop is back along the road." Pat narrowed his eyes and looked at Eddie. The eyes were close together and cunning. The mouth in the dusty beard was thin and tight. "Nope," said Pat. "Do you want the poor old cuss to die back there?" "It'll be a wonder," said Pat, "if we don't all die." "Listen, I don't have a horse. I only got the clothes I stand in. But let me take your horse and I'll go back." Pat shook his head. "By God, Pat, you're a Catholic. What will the Almighty say when you show up in heaven?" Peggy Breen came up. She was a large woman with a stronger will and a stronger mind than Pat's. "Mr. Eddie, the answer's no." "You mean you'll let old Hardcoop die?" "I got my own family to save. That's all of the job I want." Bill shrugged. He went to Frank Graves and said, "If you'll wait, I'll go back on foot. Will you wait?" "No, Bill, I can't." Graves turned to the western mountains. "See that? It's snow on the peaks. I feel as sorry for the old man as anyone. But if we poke along now, we'll all die. It wouldn't take more than half a day." "No, Bill. Every hour counts." Bill returned to his wife. "They won't," he said. They wouldn't loan a horse to save the Lord himself. He looked back across the desert. What'll we do? Eleanor was thinking of her generous and impulsive husband and of her 2 babies. She grieved for the old stranger who was sitting somewhere with bursting feet, but she was a mother with 2 children, and her own plight was hardly less desperate. We had better go on. And leave him? He might come, and later you can ask for a horse again. At noon Bill again asked for a horse and was denied. It was too late now to turn back afoot, and besides, the road had become difficult, and ahead lay a waterless desert, the extent of which none of them knew. If he were to fall behind while trying to save Hardcoop, he would be doomed, and his family with him. And so Bill went on, thinking of an old man alone by the roadside, waiting for death. Most of the emigrants were so anxious and frantic that they didn't pause when night came, but prodded their weary beasts and pushed on under a full moon. It was daylight, and they had overtaken the Donners before they made camp. Margaret Reed went at once to find Tamsen. Yes, Tamsen said, Jim Reed had been all right when she saw him last. He had spent only 1 night in their camp. Walt Heron went with him. We gave them a little food, and they had a good gun. I don't suppose, Margaret said, looking round her, that you should let the Graveses and Breens see you talking to me. They might get notions. Tamsen laughed. I don't care. We intend to travel pretty much by ourselves. Mr. Hardcoop, did you know he had been left behind? Oh, no. Bill Eddy wanted to go back, but nobody would let him borrow a horse. Oh, that's shameful. When was this? Yesterday morning, and that poor old man has been left to die? I guess we can do nothing now. He's nearly 2 days and a night behind us. They were interrupted by a terrible commotion. Graves had turned his horses out to forage over the hills, and a band of Digger Indians had stolen in and chased them off. There was an outcry from the Graves camp, and in the morning dusk there was the sound of galloping feet. Nobody could see the horses or the Indians, but they could hear them vanishing over a hill. In the Graves and Breen camps, persons were running around frantically and shouting at one another. Bill Eddy came up to the 2 women. He gestured at the eastern desert, now coming awake in the pale morning. Back there, he said, an old man sits by the road with his feet busted. Maybe he's dead now. And there, he went on, pointing northward, go Frank's saddle horses, with the Indians after them like hell and kingdom come. He grinned. I'm not a religious man myself, but it looks like the Almighty is riding with the Indians this morning. Tamsen asked, did they get all his horses? All 5 of them. Isn't anybody going after the horses? On what? Asked Bill. The only horse left now is Breen's mare, and as far as I'm concerned, the Almighty can take her too, just as soon as he gets ready. For shame, said Tamsen. Bill, you're losing your good humor. Bill Eddy shrugged. All right, he said, but if we're going to leave people in the desert to die, I don't think God will care much what happens to any of us.